evening and welcome to everyone to this annual lecture in honor of the founders of the Franciscan Friars and Sisters of the Atonement, Father Paul Wattson, who is servant of God, and Mother Mary Lurana White. Our community was founded in 1898 in the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America by two individuals who had a deep commitment to corporate poverty and to praying for the unity of Christians. And so our vocation springs from their charism, from their courageous stance that they took. Father Paul Wattson in 1908 began the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. Had a different name then. It was an octave of prayer. And in 1909, the whole congregation of friars and sisters entered into full communion with the Church of Rome. So since then, we have continued to work with the charism that has been entrusted to us, as well as other ministries that deal with the reconciliation of peoples, especially those that suffer from alcohol and drug problems. We are most happy this evening to have not only a great expert, but also a dear friend, Teresa BERGER from Yale University School of Music and the School of Religious Studies and Theology. She has worked on many dimensions of worship, and this evening we'll have one that connects us to Pope Francis's letter on ecology, Laudato Si, but not exclusively. She will take us on a horizon of different ways of thinking about how we and worship are related to the cosmos in which we live. Teresa BERGER is also an active member of the Societas Liturgica and also the North American Academy of Liturgists. So we are proud to welcome in our midst an expert not only in the field of liturgy, but also in theology and in human relations. So Teresa BERGER, most welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for your introduction. I want to begin with an acknowledgement of the two co-founders of the Franciscan Society of the Atonement, Father Paul Wattson and Mother Lurana White. Although my theme today may at first sight seem to be at some distance from the ecclesial and the ecumenical passion of these two, but actually, I would argue, issues of creation were at the heart of the Franciscan spirituality that captured Father Paul and Mother Lurana. Think, for example, of Thomas of Celano's first Vita of St. Francis, which was written only a couple of years after Francis died, so very close to the events themselves. And in this Vita, Thomas narrates the now famous story of St. Francis preaching to the birds. Yes, importantly for my subject tonight, Thomas also says that Francis not only preached to the birds, which is what Giotto depicts, but Francis encouraged the birds to praise. It's a key element in this story that often gets left out of the telling. I blame the power of Giotto's painting for that. Thomas writes, among many other things, he, Francis, said to them, "My brother birds, you should greatly praise your Creator and love him always." And then Thomas continues, after the birds had listened so reverently to the word of God, he, Francis, began to accuse himself of negligence because he had not preached them before. From that day on, he carefully exhorted all birds, all animals, all reptiles, and also insensible creatures. Think of the black truffles around the mountains of Assisi, to praise and love the Creator. So much for the Franciscan roots of my theme today. In addition, I simply want to add that the theme of creation, or the integrity of creation, has also for quite some time now been a part of ecumenical dialogues. and interestingly, more recently has become an important focus of ecumenical and liturgical work. In the US, there was an interesting document in 2012, I think, from the Methodist Roman Catholic Ecumenical Dialogue, so a regional one, dedicated to Eucharist and ecology. You will probably know about that. I read it in my classes sometimes, and people are surprised that Catholics and Methodists, instead of talking about whatever, the Petrine ministry, or talk about Eucharist and ecology. Okay, so let me come to my theme proper for this presentation. I want to think and rethink the meaning of liturgy with you for a time of ecological emergency and planetary peril. You certainly don't need me to offer statistics and data tonight to substantiate this claim that we are in a time of planetary peril. That's readily available, the statistics and the data and the images, and they rarely seem to change minds, sadly, at least not for long. The recent UN Climate Summit, COP26, some of you might have followed this, highlighted the looming climate chaos once again and for all to see, and it made news for those days of the conference and now on to Omicron and whatever else captures the headlines. And of course, the conference itself did not decisively intervene, but found compromise positions. The World Council of Churches expressed, and I quote, disappointment and dismay. Pope Francis's appeal for urgent action certainly wasn't heeded. But that doesn't mean that the larger vision of Pope Francis doesn't have things to say to us, even post COP26. What I'm particularly interested in is his strong sense of interconnectedness in the universe. And he's thinking broader than planet Earth. It is really a planetary, universal connection that he's thinking about. And you have one of his quotes here. I'll try and not read the quotes to you. You can read them yourself. So, what I want to focus on tonight is one little element of Francis's, and in this case I mean Pope Francis's larger vision, but it actually is connected to Saint Francis's vision and possible responses to the crisis we are living with. As you probably all know, much has been written and accomplished in response to Laudato Si. My own specific interest, coming from my scholarly field, liturgical studies, has to do with the Church's liturgical life. And often people will say, that's not what Laudato Si is about. Well, it begins with a prayer and it ends with two prayers. Come on, let's see what is there. So, let me try and answer this question: what on earth and in heaven does Laudato Si have to do with the planetary emergency we are living with? Everything, I want to argue. And I'll spend the rest of this presentation trying to convince you or persuade you of that fact. The heart of my argument will go something like this. Pope Francis in Laudato Si and beyond repeatedly hints at kinship relations, a community, a communion between human beings and everything that exists. Sister Earth or Mother Earth, but also everything created. So he repeatedly invokes a universal family, which can still be taken in an anthropocentric sense, as if he is thinking about the human family. But he goes on to invoke a sublime communion or a universal communion, where he's clearly thinking beyond human beings alone. Now, I want to hold that notion that is there in Laudato Si of a universal kinship between all that exists, together with the vision embedded in an ancient liturgical text still used today, the Te Deum. In the English translation of the originally Latin text, it says in a lovely rendering, all creation worships God. So my argument will essentially be, taking off from Francis's sense of a universal communion and this claim in the Te Deum that all creation worships, that we could begin to think, or should begin to think, about liturgy as essentially entering into God's presence in communion with all that is. So not only the nice people who sit in church with us, or stand, or kneel, but with everything created by God, namely, created by God as we are, so our creaturely siblings. Now, how might we get to understanding and, more importantly, maybe to living worship like this? In a sense, I think it requires a conversion, and maybe an ecological conversion is a good term for it, a new way of seeing, feeling, thinking, acting, praying. And conversion always means a turning away from and a turning towards. Pope Francis, I think, has called repeatedly for us turning away from things. In one text that you have on the screen, he talks about broken bonds of our relationship with the Creator, human beings, and everything that is, the rest of creation, and calls us to heal those damaged relationships. Now, in particular, what I think I want to turn away from and want to invite others to turn away from is to turn away from seeing liturgy and worship as something that only human creatures offer, and to turn towards and inhabit a way of praying and celebrating the liturgy as being in communion, not only with human earthlings, but with everything created. Let me step back for a second and reflect with you on the liturgical movement of the 20th century, with Vatican II and Catholic theologians and liturgists since then. I think I can say we have championed a particular image of worship, liturgy. And it basically is that of, and I've done it myself, so I'm not accusing anybody here, liturgy as an encounter, post-Vatican II often couched as dialogue between God and human beings. Liturgy is an encounter, a dialogue between God and human beings gathered for worship, or coming to God in prayer as individuals. That vision in the 20th century clearly had liberating potential, I think, because it came in response and against a tradition that for some centuries had imaged worship more like a court ceremonial, where with a tightly scripted audience, where the subjects come to humbly encounter their sovereign and pay homage and respect, as is their duty. Or in a more sort of Enlightenment narrative, a liturgy becomes a school and a classroom with students gathered for instruction and often of a moralizing kind. Or if you think more contemporarily, we might think of another image that has bubbled to the forefront, namely liturgy as a kind of holy hotspot or charging station where your batteries are recharged for the work of justice. Now, all of these images hold truth. I'm not saying any of them are wrong. We always work with images. They all offer something, they all constrain. The problem is if any of them become dominant. So that said, I'm going to propose a new dominant image. Namely, that we move beyond images that focus on God and human beings as the only dialogue partners in liturgy. And the tradition has rich possibilities of enlarging the company. Think of angels and saints in the company of heaven, the dead who have gone before, creation story in Job 38, the morning stars begin to sing. So we have resources. What I want in the tradition, what I want to focus on is a way of thinking that everything created joins in our prayer and praise of the Creator. Now, what room might there be to think about creation and the cosmos as a foundational part of the encounter of human beings with the triune God? I'm not trying to add an extra kind of whipped cream to liturgical theology and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to think about this also? I'm trying to say, no, you cannot worship if you aren't on that firm foundation. So, for those interested in constructive theology, and I'll keep this brief, but here is a quick map of how theologically we might get to that being convincing. We could argue like this, and very ecumenically so. Step 1, the conviction that the universe is brought into existence not by chance, but by the creative energy of God. I don't think that there is any Christian who couldn't, with some tweaking, consent to that. Second, that being created and called into existence is gift. So we are not making a scientific statement, we are making a theological statement. Being created means gifted into existence, loved into existence. And the telos, the aim of being called into existence is flourishing, I think, which orients everything created to what? To thankful praise. Third, creation, although deeply marred by sin, evil, and violence, is continuously God-sustained. So this is trying to weave God's ongoing presence into creation as we know it. And then fourth, with Christmas approaching, could this be left out? The claim that God entered this created but marred order in deepest intimacy by taking on human form in Jesus of Nazareth, living and dying as part of created reality. Again, just on a side note, we've often taken the incarnation I think in very anthropocentric ways. God becomes human. Yes, sure, God becomes human. But that means God also becomes the iron that runs through our blood. God becomes the stardust from which all of us descended. God becomes materiality. So it's not, you can read it more deeply than anthropocentrically. God enters material created reality, all of it. And then fourth and finally, everything God has created is on a journey through time to its ultimate fulfillment in God, when the profoundest response of everything created will be joyful adoration and worship. So that's the kind of fast food, fast theology version of how I would construct the underlying theological steps that help me get to where I want to go, namely to think of liturgy as in an expansive and cosmic way. Now, for tonight, I will root my thinking mostly in Pope Francis, especially Laudato Si. And as I've said, what's key for me in the encyclical is the startling move Francis makes, startling in light of the encyclical tradition that went before. The startling move he makes is that he envisions kinship relations between human beings and Mother or Sister Earth. These are, I want to stress, familial, not familiar, but familial categories. To think humans as part of a family that includes everything created, I think is a revelatory, and I don't mean new by that, but it's a startling claim about reality. And it shifts not only how we think about the cosmos and creation, but how we think about human beings. I'll say more about that in a second. I'm showing you in the next slide one of the quotes that highlight this sense of universal communion, that if you track the terminology, it's there in Laudato Si right through. The original Latin is simply universalis communio, and Pope Francis doesn't invent that term. It actually comes about 100 years earlier in Teilhard de Chardin's early letter, Text the Priest, where he talks in French about the communion universelle that he experiences in the trenches of World War I, of all places. For a scholar of liturgy, this is, of course, where it gets really fascinating. Communion is not least a liturgical term. We go to communion, we receive communion, we pray in communion with the Pope, the living and the dead. I, as a Western Rite Catholic, Roman Catholic, pray in full communion with Eastern Rite Catholics, and in many ways in communion, even if not full communion, with our Christian siblings who are not Roman Catholic. But let's return to Pope Francis. I think it's important to claim that these are not simply poetic words. Oh yeah, he's into, poetry. Well, he might be that too. But there are deep theological insights here. And this notion of kinship with everything created in Laudato Si and elsewhere has immediate consequences for lived life and for worship. Let me highlight a couple. In Laudato Si, Francis claims that the interconnection God has established between us and everything around us forces us to feel, for example, desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and extinction of species as a painful disfigurement. The German translation of Laudato Si puts it even starker. It says, this is a maiming. We experience this, or should experience it, as a maiming or an amputation for us if other species suffer extinction. Because, and he says, because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence. that actually bled into, in a remarkable way, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation after the synod on the Amazon. I love this quote, not the picture, but but the quote that gives voice, in a sense, to the picture of this fusion of blending of human voices with the voices of the foliage. And it's not just any sound, it's song, the song of the foliage. What I want to suggest is that this vision allows us a glimpse of worship, calls us into worship as something infinitely larger than a group of nice human beings gathered in a nice church building. And the broader vision is one of a shared space of worship, a communion with all that exists. Worship here becomes visible as a posture or way of life of all creation, and human beings as part of a creaturely family that worships. So, turning away from worship as the task of human beings alone, and turning to now Christian worship in communion with everything created. Now, I hope what I've presented so far puts a question mark behind much of what you might usually think of as liturgy or worship. The fundamental question, though, is whether such a seemingly novel or revolutionary vision of worship can be substantiated from within the Christian scriptures and the history of worship through the centuries. And my answer to that is simply and emphatically a yes. So Pope Francis, like Saint Francis, is not an eccentric outlier with a particular eco-freak calling, but he articulates, they both articulated something that is actually there in the tradition consistently so over centuries, but has often been occluded in the ways we display liturgical tradition, or relegated to, oh, these are mystical experiences, as if somehow they aren't real. Well, they might be the most real we have. So, just some glimpses of what is there in the tradition. I will keep this short. Beginning with the scriptures, Exhibit A would be Psalm 148, and one of the early morning psalms since the earliest centuries. And if you study the text in some detail, you'll see that the psalmist actually sets up a cosmic antiphonal choir. The voices in heaven or above the earth, so sun, moon, stars, waters above the heavens, the cosmology of the day, of course. What else can they do? And then the other side of the choir comes from the earth, the sea monsters, fire, hail, snow, frost, stormy wind, mountains, hills, fruit trees, cedars, and so on and so forth. And then come the humans as part of, and they aren't even the first, they come last. To make a long story short, that the psalm doesn't stand alone in the biblical witness. Think of the Benedicite, the parts of Daniel 3 that we have from the Septuagint, but also the book of Revelation. The chapters 4 and 5 have embedded in them this vision of a cosmic worship that includes heaven, earth, everything under the earth, the sea, and so on, singing together. The same theme, and this will just be a rapid fire run through 2,000 years of history, is there in Tertullian at the end of his exegesis of the Lord's Prayer. He says, "Orat omnis creatura," all creation worships. And it's actually a way he shames human beings by pointing to creatures who seem to pray better or more naturally than humans do. It's there, so the same theme is there in the apostolic tradition, in Eastern Eucharistic prayer, the Anaphora of St. James. It's there in the Phosilaron, so a early Greek evening hymn, the Te Deum, the Gloria Laus et Honor. Some of these we still part of our liturgy. It's there, of course, in St. Francis, but also in Hildegard of Bingen, in Henry Suso's Life of the Servant, and in hymns until you come to early modernity. And then it goes a bit underground. And there are reasons for that, but I keep that to myself for now. What I seek to do is to retrieve this ancient vision of worship as a crucial element of lived faith, not only through the ages, but especially for us today. And my interest in this, of course, is not simply that of a historian. I'm driven by contemporary realities of the simple fact that we live on a planet in peril, and that I have a child who will have to live on this planet when I don't have to anymore. Let me bring in another element, not another element, just another source to sort of round up, in a sense, the historical fast overview and bring us to the liturgical practice very much of today. What I want to highlight is an interesting text in our current missal that some of us will have prayed with for decades and might never have paid too much attention to. It comes from the third Eucharistic prayer, so a Eucharistic prayer drawn up after Vatican II based on earlier sources. After the Sanctus, the Missal in its current English translation says, "All you have created rightly gives you praise." The Latin text is terse, "Merito te laudat omnis a te condita creatura." If you read through different vernacular translations, it's really interesting how they don't want to say what the Latin text says. You don't want to quite say it. They sort of veil it. One of the maybe few wonderful things about the current English translation, which was forced to go back to very clear Latinate ways of praying, a nightmare in most cases, but in this case it's actually great because it forced the translators to stay with the very clear Latin text. So, all you have created, rightly gives you praise. How do we get to living that? Well, a lot of ecological activism is there, bubbling up from the ground. There is creation-attentive liturgical work that has intensified. We have a season for creation now. There are lots of secular creation-based rituals around. Most Christian traditions in their own context have witnessed a veritable deluge of new worship materials over the past few decades that chime in on that subject of creation. Often it's, let's praise God for creation. There isn't, which is fine and important, but what interests me is a different posture when we think of creation as praising with us. Just one little example that I didn't have time to encounter this visit at Rome, so you have to bring me back, is the living chapel that has been put up in the Botanical Garden in Rome. Go sometime. It's really very interesting, motivated by a Franciscan spirit. I think one interesting support for what I want to think comes from contemporary sciences and their insights. Let me list just a couple of them. We now know that human beings share with all other living creatures on planet Earth a common genetic ancestry. So not only is our DNA, I think, 99% the same as chimpanzees, but a quarter of our ancestry, maybe slightly less, is shared with trees. And if we go back far enough, we all come from stardust. So there is a thread of genetic similarity, not only between all human beings, but everything created. Let me give you a wonderful quote from my colleague at Yale, Mary Evelyn Tucker. She runs the Forum on Religion and Ecology. And I quote, "Our challenge is to see ourselves as part of a vast universe where the cosmos too is our home, not only planet Earth, but the cosmos. Many cultures have embraced this perspective, beginning with indigenous peoples. Their cosmovisions continue to provide them with a rich sensibility of the stars as relatives and galaxies as luminous living presence. All humans are descendants of these heavenly bodies. The stars are our ancestors." And that's simply a claim of science. That's not poetry or mysticism. Science tells us that. Let me highlight, and yes, I will be coming to a close, some points for theological reflection that I think come out of what I've presented so far. And I'll raise them in the form of questions, because for me this is very much a thinking in process. So first, and it harkens back in a sense to Mary Evelyn Tucker and others, what would it look like to situate the emergence of practices of human and specifically Christian worship within the much older, more ancient practice of primordial praise that arose when the morning stars began to sing, if you want to call on Job's creation story? If we step back, we have to admit that human prayer and praise are very much latecomers in this cosmic praise. In terms of the universe, I've given you a picture of the emergence of the universe, and I know the print is very small, so let me give you another narrative. If we imagine life on planet Earth condensed in 1 hour, and then map when life emerges in the ocean, human beings emerge in the last, 30 seconds. Do we really think that nobody praised God before we stood up? I don't think so. But that then raises a question. For example, if you teach the history of Christian worship, where do you begin? Do you begin with the first flaring forth, or with Israel, admirably, or with Jesus, or Pentecost? You know, we have choices to make. Second question, I'm fascinated with pondering the power of appreciating createdness, this posture of recognizing that all of us, and I don't mean human beings, everything created stands in the same relationship to God as I do, foundationally as having been created. And I think it's a great equalizer in a sense. Whatever we then claim about human beings and how they might be special, the basic foundation is the same between myself and the little lizard who came to visit my room at San Donofrio yesterday. We both stand before God in the posture of having been created. Third question. I think there may be something in this thinking of worship as more than what human beings do that has life-giving potential at this point in time. And I say this because I witness in my own context that ecclesial practices have become deeply, deeply suspect. Many of our contemporaries are not only leaving established ecclesial institutions and practices behind in vast numbers, but at the same time, with incredible faith, they turn to a host of diffuse, seemingly ancient, nature-based or planetary rituals. I mean, I have students who want to dance around trees, worshiping Gaia, when I might want to talk to them about the worship of the triune God. That's just, lame, they think. So, why not break open a path within the richness of our liturgical tradition to a world around us that thinks of ecclesial practices as suspect or simply not life-giving? In conclusion, let me return to Father Paul and Mother Lurana and their Franciscan spirituality. I'm thinking in particular of the notion of atonement, also with creation. And I think I would be amiss if I did not outline a couple of ways, at least, in which my thoughts on worship, the liturgy, link directly to issues of environmental justice, atonement with creation in the liturgy of life. The first is very minor, but we start with our own lives. So I would invite you to practice mindfulness, to reconfigure how you think about places of worship and with whom. Seek to live in universal communion with all that is in your daily life. Practice compassion towards all that exists. And a bit more lightheartedly, yes, don't be afraid to hug a tree. You share a quarter of your genetic material with trees after all. And you can feel yourself communing with a tree that is your creaturely sibling that worships the Creator. You will see that you are in good company with that in a second. Pope Francis, I think, once again helps us here. And I don't mean by him hugging a tree, but with a stark challenge he has presented us with to rethink basically everything. Economics, politics, daily living. So my example for the season of Advent is for us to think about Christmas not only as this wonderful celebration of God becoming material reality and a human being, but also it is one of the largest trash-consuming moments of the year. So let's change that in how we celebrate. Third, and this might sound very Catholic, but we have a commitment as Catholics to a seamless garment of life that often is translated as a commitment to the sanctity of human life from conception to natural birth. There is more to the seamless garment of life. It doesn't begin with human conception. It begins with everything created. Pope Francis has called on us, and I quote here, Each of us can play a valuable role if we all set out today, not tomorrow, but today. And he challenges us to make a choice between what matters and what does not, between continuing to ignore and mistreating our common home, the earth, or to commit ourselves at every level to transforming the way we act. And I would only add to that acting includes worship. It's an act of worship. So go and reconfigure how you celebrate liturgy and pray. Thank you for your attention.
Once again, Teresa, thank you for the input that you gave, the impulses that you gave, which is so important. And I think if I were to put a word around it, it would be our numbness to our creation. That is, that we don't think about where we are. We don't conscientiously put ourselves in relationship to things like that. We are taking them for granted. But I'm not here to give a second lecture. I want to hear what all of you, I was struck by that, and all the way through that you said that, I kept saying, well, that's right. We are not living in this world with eyes open and spirits akin to our creation.
I'm Sylvia Gazanel, and I'm a former student of Teresa's, and someone who has had battles with Teresa in the past. And I only want to say that I want to say thank you, because this is, I can't think of an exception. This is the most beautiful, thought-provoking, and life-expanding thing I've heard in a long time. So thank you. That's all. No pushback.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can say something about how this can be put into practice. I'm a Benedictine monk. We pray the Psalms. We celebrate the Eucharist every day. But of course, I mean, it's already in the Desert Fathers and St. Benedict argues very strongly, we come together to pray because this might or should or could help us to pray always. No, this is to pray always is the monk's existence. So how would you tell us or me that this becomes reality? And then, of course, a second question would be, because I think you made us, or at least me, curious why, especially in early modernity, this was being lost. So it's theory and practice, the questions.
I think the practice you have to figure out yourself. I say this because I don't have a monastic vocation. I had to figure it out and continue to have to figure it out as someone teaching at Yale, having a garden, and so on and so forth. There are ways in which I can try and synchronize my praying. I've learned in ways that expand my vision of prayer. So when I begin now to pray, I turn to the outside. I have to see what is outside. I want to pray in communion with the sun or the moon or the stars. But those are little things that and I'm sorry this is so personal, but that's how I had to get to it. How I went forward very gingerly with thinking, this is not something that I can only solve with books and ancient sources. I need to live it and see how to live it in my own life. But that's also a radically individual process. Sometimes I chant in my garden, and try and synchronize with the singing of the birds. Yeah, I know it sounds cuckoo, but it can be done. Take your monks outside sometime and tell them the son, to think sonically as their praise, as joining with the sonic world beyond the church at San Anselmo. Yeah, I know you look very skeptical, and that's okay. Early modernity is my favorite enemy. So, in terms of historical, and I know that's a lame response, but the short version would be of why my hunch is that this might be a problematic moment is that we begin to see the rise of secular science and more anthropocentric ways of narrating the world and existence. So what drops out? The angels and the demons and the stars as conversation partners, and that's a very rough and tumble response, but I think there might be something there to investigate further. That's work I need to do. And I might prove myself wrong. In hymns, it continues to be transported, that notion, but not in theological treatises. So it becomes a niche for more poetic ways of expression. Good enough as a, okay. Good.
Teresa, may I give a run at your first part of the answer? Knowing monastic life and mendicant life, I think there's something that the early liturgical tradition teaches us, that we are created with sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and that all of these things in the celebration of the sacraments, especially in initiation, were brought together so that we became a whole being as we are born again in this universe. The coldness of the water, the warmth of the oil, the smell of the chrism, the taste of the bread, the wine, the milk, honey, all of those were the early forms of how the church brought people into the creation of the church. And I think what happens, that's why I said we become numb because we don't use those senses anymore. We reduce them to minimalism, and we don't allow them to speak. Mm-hmm. And so they're all parts of creation, as I see it anyway. And certainly the mendicants and the monastic one, silence has something to do with it. Why did we have great silence at night? What did we hear? What did we see? We were in the seas. What did you see at night?
Yeah,
the moon and the stars. And the expression that came is that it's incredible that we're a small speck, but we're a part of that.
Yeah. There is a fascinating 3rd century Syriac text, probably from earlier, but anyway, it's a horarium, but it's not a monastic one as you would know it, that says, Benedict says Compline is then and blah, blah, blah for that. And it's a horarium that maps simply 24 hours of the day, a night. And it tells you for every hour who the worshiping creatures are. So I've tried to map my own existence with that. It'll be, I'm making this up now, I don't have the text in front of me. At 7 in the morning, the doves enter to praise. At 8 in the morning, the winds enter to praise. At 9 in the morning, the wild animals come. At 10, what a community in prayer that has something like that. What must they have been thinking? Was their community of praise? And of course, then liturgical scholars just forgot about that source. It's too strange, it doesn't fit. And anyway, I'm passionate about that, so.
It's okay. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm always trying to integrate things.
I remember.
Yes. And so what I hear, and which also happens to respond to something interior in me, is that in order to cultivate this kind of practice, one needs to cultivate an attunement, an attention, a quality of attention which also springs from silence, for those who pray silently, attunement to a wider perception, right, beyond the self, which I think was what we're always called to, yes, and that will open up the awareness of the birds or the sound of, where I live right now. You see these very unusual, at least in my experience, flocks of birds at dusk that just move in these waves.
There is a technical term, murmurations.
Well, there you go. It's these movements are really quite extraordinary, and I've never seen anything like that. But I think it's a prayer in that,
I try not to think of what and how it is a prayer, specifically, because then we end up with a nice creation. The beautiful birds moving or the beautiful sound. I want to be able to think that some really nasty animals also pray, although they frighten me. So I'm trying to stay away from suggesting, but you pray with your murmuration and let me know what happens. Yes,
I'm thinking of my own Methodist tradition and some of what you were speaking about today. And as Methodists, we look back, of course, to the writings of John Wesley, who writes about the image of God within all of us, being created in the likeness and image of God, and locates that in three ways: is in the natural, political, and the moral images. And we like to stress the natural and the moral, which is about free will and about holiness, which Methodists historically are known for. But the political image is about being called into creation and relationship, not only with others, but with all of creation. And I think it's maybe a part for us as Methodists in the 21st century of trying to recover that. But having said that, I'm curious about how you think your approach to liturgy reorients us in an ecumenical way. How does it reorient how we think about worship and communion?
Presumably, it's a challenge for all ecclesial bodies to think of a broader communion. And with the kind of communion, let's say cosmic communion, that I'm thinking about, the differences between Methodists and Catholics and the Orthodox and the Anglicans, they get resituated. And I don't want to say they lose weight, because that would not be where I would want to go, but they are put in a different context, and that changes perspectives, I think. How exactly, I need to think about that more.
So thank you very, very, very much for all your insights. I like all very much, particularly this idea of liturgy as a dialogue, but also what you mentioned in terms of science and mysticism almost coming together. I had a question two questions actually, from the very beginning, and now after this interesting exchange, I'm even more willing to pose the question to you. Now, I know in a sense you already answered with the first answer you gave. We have to work our own ways, but still I would like to share these thoughts, and maybe if you want to give an answer, I would be grateful. My first concern is in terms of educational tools, for children, for example. We want to try to educate them to the liturgy, to a meaningful liturgy. We want to educate them to care of creation. In one sense, it should be much easier because, for example, now they're much more aware that the planet is dying. But in the perspective of your talk, I think it would be much more difficult because children nowadays are not really very accustomed to be silent and listen to the birds or just enjoy the silence of nature. So in terms of educational tools, that would be my questions. What do you think is the way, the approach that could be, because from your talk I thought we should really turn all our educational tools upside down and find something very different, So that would be my question. And the other one would be, do you think, since you mentioned the ecumenical framework, do you think that there is a Christian tradition that has preserved more in her liturgical stories or approaches this sense that you gave to us? Because I was thinking about some, but I would like to hear from you. Thank you very much.
The latter is easier to answer than your first part, so I'll do the easy one first. Some of the Eastern ecclesial traditions, I'm thinking of the Syriac tradition particularly, and I'm not a specialist in that, but I have friends who will say when I bring this up, oh, look into our liturgical books, we have, it's right there. And I say, yes, it is. You've continued that much stronger than I see it. So there are some ecclesial traditions that seem to have held on. Others are bringing it in now. Education, that is, and education of children, and I simply don't know. It's not something I know too much about, and I would simply say it's very important. Other people than myself who know that world need to, or I would encourage them to work at that. I will simply stand by the sidelines and applaud, but I don't have any expertise to give.
Well, once again, Teresa, thank you so much for stimulating us, for helping us to pause and reflect. And I think it's a good Advent theme about what you gave to us. Some will find this difficult, others will rejoice at it. But in any event, we're not going to leave without something happening here. So I want to thank you once again, not only for what you presented, but also for who you are and the presence that you bring and the science that you share with us. So thank you so much. And to all of you, we like to wish you an early Merry Christmas, but a good continuation. We're only at the third Sunday of Advent, so let's think about what is before us, not in welcoming a little baby, but in terms of welcoming the Lord of Glory as He comes. So thank you all for coming and sharing with us this evening, and I wish you all peace and all good. Thank you.